This podcast is brought to you by Odiogo.com.
Deadly time vortex appears over Antarctica. Sector of erupting anomalies. Disturbing news has been leaking out from the giant continent at the bottom of the world. Some scientists manning lonely outposts under the drifting and shifting aurora are nearly paralyzed with fear. Their clip reports are being reviewed by astonished superiors back in the home countries. Russian researchers posted near the giant South Pole subglacial Lake Vostok have reported eerie anomalies and incidents over the past few years that sometimes seem to border on the frayed edge of creeping madness. Artificial structure found under 2 miles of ice during April 2001. One of the world's great secrets was revealed. An ancient structure or apparatus that lay encased miles under the hard Antarctic ice was detected by a roving spy satellite. The U.S. military immediately moved to quash the reports and the mainstream news media dutifully complied. Despite the news blackout, reports still surfaced that a secretive excavation project had commenced on the heels of the discovery. Some European countries formally protested the excavation by the U.S. military. Excavation deep into the ice. What's down there? If it's something the U.S. military has constructed down there, then they're violating the International Antarctic Treaty, said an aide to Nicole Fontaine, at the time he was the European Parliament's French president. If not, then it's something that's at least 12,000 years old, which is how long ice has covered Antarctica. That would make it the oldest man-made structure on the planet. The Pentagon should heed the calls of Congress and release whatever it's hiding. The federal government and the Pentagon ignored the calls. High technology and strange events. U.S. Air Force's incredible subterranean giant Earth borer. Soon after, some military observers noted that robotic devices were being shipped to the South Pole, and speculation erupted about the belief by some that the U.S. Air Force had transported their mammoth nuclear-powered tunnel boring machine, the Subterrane, on AC-5A to a secret Antarctic base. The Subterrane, a cylindrical vessel that is said man with a crew of 4 to 6, is capable of subterranean travel and has undergone tests in Nevada, Colorado and New Mexico. Designed to bore through hard rock strata, drilling into the ice would be like a laser cutting through a marshmallow. Earth borer, like a laser cutting through a marshmallow. Following the frenzied events of early 2001, the news broke of a mysterious medical emergency that forced an evacuation of unnamed personnel during the depths of the Antarctic winter, the first event of its kind during the dangerous South Pole winter season. Shortly after that, the region was shaken by an unusual earthquake. Seismologists located the trembler at the epicenter of the buried structure in East Antarctica. Yet still the military resisted making any comment. A magnetic anomaly formed, intensified, and spread to the vicinity of the Russian Vostok base. Russian researchers were shocked and puzzled. Meanwhile, the American military airfield buzzed with activity as flights came and went at a dizzying pace. Heavy machinery, some pretty exotic, appeared on the bleak Antarctic ice sheet. Unverified reports claimed that the nuclear-powered Earth borer Subterrane arrived. Subterrane sent to explore prehistoric machine? Finally, the American and European media were pressing hard for some believable answers when 9/11 occurred and the U.S. was suddenly under terrorist attack. Domestic and international focus immediately shifted from the Antarctic to New York City and Washington, D.C. The mysterious events in Antarctica were forgotten. 2002, TV crew disappears. A California TV crew filming in the Antarctic went missing in November 2002. Supposedly, a video discovered among the crew's personal effects by a special U.S. Navy SEAL rescue team tasked to find the filmmakers confirmed earlier reports of a huge artifact buried under the ice, a prehistoric machine that may be of alien origin. The U.S. government said it will seek to block the airing of a video found by Navy rescuers in Antarctica that purportedly reveals that a massive archaeological dig is underway 2 miles beneath the ice, stated a press release that appeared briefly on the studio production's website. Time vortex erupts as one bizarre event followed another. A research team of U.S. and U.K. scientists accidentally came across a mind-numbing discovery. While working on a joint weather research project, the team witnessed the creation of a spinning vortex of time. U.S. physicist Marianne McLean allegedly testified that she and her colleagues became aware of a spinning gray fog in the sky over their heads. They initially dismissed the phenomenon as merely part of a random polar storm. The spiraling vortex, however, did not disperse. Stranger still, despite gusts of wind and briskly moving clouds overhead, the weird spinning gray fog remained stationary. Intense magnetic anomaly. Deciding to explore the odd phenomena, the group took one of its weather balloons and attached a meteorological instrument to it that calibrated temperature, barometric pressure, humidity, wind speed and a scientific chronometer to record the times of the readings. After attaching a cable to the balloon, and securing the other end to a winch, they released it. The balloon and instrument package soared upwards and were immediately sucked into the gaping maw of the swirling vortex. The balloon and instruments disappeared. Tunneled to the past after several minutes, they decided to retrieve the balloon. Despite some difficulty with the winch, they succeeded in bringing the balloon back to Earth and checked the instruments. McLean stated that everyone was stunned by the readout on the chronometer. It displayed a date decades in the past, January 27, 1965. McLean claimed the experiment was repeated several times with the same result. Later, she said, the entire episode was reported to military intelligence and passed on to the White House. Presumably the strange vortex phenomenon, a highly magnetic tunnel to the past, was codenamed the Time Gate by military intelligence. Magnetic time tunnel to the past? As the phenomenon was generated in the same general vicinity as the discovery of the giant apparatus deep under the ice, it's thought the two may be related. If indeed a magnetic time vortex is appearing and disappearing over Antarctica, and if the phenomena is not natural, but generated by some unknown technology deep under the ice cap, it may reveal the physics of time and could potentially allow control of the past, and by implication the future. If true, it's no wonder the military is so intensely interested and so closed-mouthed about it.
"7 days ago, one of my satellites over Antarctica discovered a pyramid.
Where exactly on the ice is this?
It's not on the ice. It's 2,000 feet under it. Let's make history."
Needs Hess when Hess runs off to Great Britain on that crazy peace mission in May of 1941. But Hess definitely was a man that was interested in the occult, in esoteric literature and lore and legends like Atlantis and so on. So it's very interesting that you have these two gentlemen, Rudolf Hess and Hermann Goering, that sponsored the the German expedition to Antarctica that traveled down to Antarctica in the autumn of 1938, specially outfitted. They even got Admiral Byrd from this country to come over and lecture the Nazi expedition people on the conditions that they would expect to find in Antarctica and so on and so forth. So there's even a connection of this expedition to the post-war expedition of Admiral Byrd, because, of course, he goes down there with Operation High Jump in 1947, returns. It's outfitted for 8 months, and he returns after a few weeks, gives a very strange interview on the way back to a reporter from Il Mercurio of Santiago de Chile, talking about, the United States is going to have to prepare to defend itself against enemy fighters that can fly from pole to pole with tremendous speed. And this is reported in the El Mercurio. I actually have a photograph of the article I believe it's in my book, The Nazi International. So anyway, this gave rise, of course, to all sorts of mythologies within the alternative research community that Admiral Byrd's forces had either encountered extraterrestrial UFOs down there or some sort of Nazi hidden flying saucer research base, which, again, is one of those myths that's out there. I do not subscribe to it. I want to make that absolutely clear. But it is clear that the Germans went to Antarctica in 1938 and 39. The expedition returned to Germany in 1939 as the war clouds were gathering for the Second World War. So the real question is, why do you have someone like Hermann Goering, who, of course, founds the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe? He founds the Gestapo. He is in charge of the Nazi economic and rearmament plans. And Rudolf Hess, on the other hand, a guy that's up to his earlobes in occult doctrine and occult connections and so on and so forth. Why are these two men sponsoring this expedition? And I do suspect that when you look at Antarctica itself, if there is any place on the surface of this planet that could fulfill the basic requirements of the Atlantis legend, as Plato outlined it in the Critias and Timaeus, it would be Antarctica, because it's an entire continent that quite literally is submerged underwater. That is to say, under lots and lots of ice. So I do think that there's this hidden Nazi connection, or hidden esoteric connection to the Nazi expedition, and it may have played a hidden motivation to that. The trouble is, we know very little about that expedition, because when it returned to Nazi Germany, Goering had a medallion struck to commemorate the expedition, and of course the crew members were given medallions, and it was briefly reported on the Deutsche Wochenschau, the weekly newsreels throughout Germany. But after that, you didn't hear anything more about it, and pretty much everything that the expedition may have discovered was probably classified by the Nazis, which is why it's so difficult to find out anything about it that has a provenance in terms of evidentiary value that you can trust to use for it. There have been reports of occasional newsreels and films that appear occasionally on the internet, but it's difficult to assess whether they're legitimate or not. So we're left questioning. But I do think, given Hess's involvement, his interest in the occult, and then, of course, given Heinrich Himmler's extreme interest in occult and esoteric matters, that this may indeed have been one of the motivations for the Nazis to go down there. I suspect that if that is true, then you're dealing with another speculation that they were perhaps looking for potential lost technology of that civilization. So there is a Nazi connection here. The more difficult part of your question is the Hermetica. Is there a connection of that body of literature to Atlantis? And right up front, you have to acknowledge that the Hermetica itself makes very, very few, if any, outright allusions to it. However, the Hermetica do claim to be the writings and wisdom that was passed down through the ages in Egypt from the lost wisdom god Tehuda, who, according to the legends, stored all of his knowledge of science and mathematics and so on two pillars. And of course, that has raised speculation that the Great Pyramid and some of the other pyramids were these pillars. The problem with the Hermetica, as I pointed out in that book, was that the Renaissance humanists in Italy, Cosimo de' Medici, was in fact the man that paid money for the Greek texts of the Hermetica and then eventually published them in Italy. They had been handed down, and there were bits and pieces of the Hermetica that were known in Western Europe prior to his publication of them, but the entire text was a different matter, and this is what he got his hands on and eventually published. The tendency of the Renaissance at that time was to take the Hermetica texts at their word, that they did indeed represent the lost teachings of Egypt. And of course, this caused a firestorm, if you want to put it that way, of controversy at the time. And eventually, because the Hermetica were so influential during the Renaissance, an English scholar by the name of Isaac Casaubon, delved into the question of their authenticity. And he made a case, and quite a very good one, that there were the presence of Greek words in the Hermetica that dated no earlier than the 2nd century AD. So in other words, they couldn't, they weren't even as old as Plato. So they couldn't possibly be something handed down from ancient Egypt and the ancient Egyptian wisdom god. And their matters rested academically, more or less, since the Renaissance, up until about 2 to 3 decades ago. What Casaubon's study did is it essentially drove Hermetic thinking and the texts themselves back underground for quite a period of time, because the humanists could no longer appeal to them as a body of text that predated the biblical text. This is essentially what happened. The interesting thing is that modern scholars, many of them coming out of Oxford, have re-examined Casaubon's argument, and they have pointed out its fundamental flaw, which is a very modern one, and it's almost taken for granted. We have the idea that if you write a text and put your name on it, then the text originates with you, okay? This is the essential logic underwriting Casaubon. The problem is the ancients don't have that understanding of authorship. What the ancient conception of authorship is if the ideas or the concepts embodied predominantly in whatever text that you're dealing with come from an identifiable source, then that's the source of it. So in other words, an ancient will sit down and write a text, and if he thinks that he's following or is actually following the teaching of any particular school, then he'll attribute the ideas and origins not to himself or, dressing them up, but to the original, what they regard as the original font for them. So in other words, what modern academics have done is they've gone back and they've pointed out that many of the ideas in the Hermetica are indeed very clearly drawn from ancient Egyptian religion, and they're simply dressed up in a Greek text. So in other words, they've more or less overthrown this whole idea of Casaubon, and that, simply because a word or several words in a text don't date from the time period that the ideas originate in doesn't necessarily mean that you're dealing with a text that in its central conceptual components is not very ancient. So if that's the case, then we have to go back to what the Hermetica actually say. They make the claim that they are coming ultimately from any ancient Egyptian wisdom that is traceable back to the wisdom god Tehuta, who, of course, the Greeks called Hermes. And if you look at the Egyptian text, Tehuta is often called the twice great, or so on and so forth. So it was very natural when Alexander conquers Egypt and brings all of his Greeks with him, and they start examining these Greek texts talking about Tehuta, that they identify him with Hermes. Okay, there's that factor involved in all of this, but given the modern scholarship, basically they've thrown the door wide open again that these texts could indeed be, in some of their core elements, something traceable back to an antediluvian period of Egypt. And, when you say that, then you're immediately bringing up ideas of floods and Atlantis and so on and so forth. So, yeah, this has been an argument that's been going on for centuries, in other words, and it doesn't look like it's going to stop anytime soon. The Nazis certainly would have been aware of the text of the Hermetica. German scholars studied it just like British and French and Italian scholars studied it. So it's not something they would have been unaware of. I don't know of any extant document or evidence that definitely connects their Antarctic expedition to any Hermetic influence. But again, this is a case where they would have been guessing between the lines, much like we are, and thinking that, well, okay, if there's one place on Earth that fills the basic bill for Plato's Atlantis legend, then it would be Antarctica. The way I've handled the Atlantis myth is I'm doing one of those exercises where you say, okay, assuming what they say to be true, what are the implications? Well, if we go back and look at Plato and his dialogues where he's talking about Atlantis, he tells you very directly that he is repeating a story he heard from his uncle, who in turn had been initiated into the Egyptian mysteries by an Egyptian priest. So in other words, number one, Plato up front is telling you that you have to accept me on my word that I'm hearing this story and that I'm not talking big allegories here, that I'm not making up fiction. And number two, if that's the case, you also have to reckon in the fact that if you're dealing with wisdom that's been handed down, it's been handed down probably in a form that is designed to both reveal and conceal wisdom over a prolonged period of time. Mm-hmm. So I've taken the Atlantis story to be kind of a multi-layered, deliberately constructed allegory that can be true on a multiplicity of levels. In other words, it may have a terrestrial solution. It may have an extraterrestrial solution, because we have to remember that for the ancients, terms like continents or mountains could be used interchangeably with planets. Terms like oceans were often, or abysses. The abyss was something that they used for actual physical oceans with lots of water. And it was also a term that they also used for space, for interplanetary space. It was, it was an ocean to them. So in other words, once you understand that the ancients are speaking in a multitude of levels at the same time, and approach the Atlantis story in that fashion, then it could be true on a multitude of levels. There could have been really a continent, but by the same token, it could be an allegory for a mountain or a continent that sank under the ocean. In other words, a planet that literally disappeared into the abyss of space. And this is the approach I basically took in my book, The Cosmic War. You have the idea that there was a planet in the solar system long ago that blew up. So, the way I approach the Atlantis story is that this is yet another one of those ancient mythologies that was deliberately crafted in a multi-layered way. And I think if you look at the Nazis, it's safe to speculate that perhaps they looked at that story in that way. And the reason I say that is that in 1935, Heinrich Himmler began to recruit people into the SS that had, let's just say, esoteric credentials. In other words, they were experts on occult lore, literature, legend, and so on. And eventually he establishes, I believe it was in 1940, he establishes officially, although this department actually existed prior to its official establishment. So you find that pattern a lot in Nazi Germany. It's the German equivalent of plausible deniability. Okay, so you have a lot of these departments existing unofficially, but then there's a decree that officially establishes them. The SS, Heinrich Himmler, established a department within the SS called the Ahnenerbe-Dienst, okay, in German. That means the Ancestral Research Bureau, okay? And in the little memo or directive that he issued to establish this thing, this was a department set up solely to investigate occult lore, legend, literature, practice, of all types, no matter how loony it seemed. It was established to investigate every little last nook and cranny of what we would consider the occult or esoteric or alternative legend and lore for, and this is the key point, for its potential military application. So in other words, folks, what Nazi Germany is telling you is that it's the first modern great power that has technological sophistication, that's deliberately going out and looking for a lot of ancient stuff for its potential military application. So in other words, we now have the weaponization of archaeology, if you want to put it that way. To me, this is a clear signal that the Nazis suspect there's something up. So something is going on in these ancient texts that clearly indicate that there's a very sophisticated, very destructive technology that simply went missing when we blew ourselves apart in an earlier period of human history, that's now lost in the mists of prehistory and lost in these legends and texts and lore. So I think it's, given all of these kind of background circumstances, I think it's a plausible speculation to argue that, yes, they were going down to Antarctica to look for something, which they suspected may have been there. So, put that in the context of the fact that, Secretary of State John Kerry just made a little junket to Antarctica. We've got Prince Harry of Great Britain. We've got King Juan Carlos of Spain, before he died, went to Antarctica. The Patriarch of Moscow a few months ago. Russia itself is saying, well, he was down there to bless an Orthodox chapel for the Russian mission there, which, that's a plausible cover story. But the fact of the matter is, any Orthodox bishop can go down there and bless that chapel. Why do you have to get the head of the Russian Orthodox Church to do this? And, do it after his meeting with Pope Francis on top of that. So, it's a very strange list of people that have shown an interest in Antarctica. And if you add it all together, what you have is Hermann Goering, Rudolf Hess, John Kerry, Buzz Aldrin, Kirill III, Prince Harry, King Juan Carlos. That's a very bizarre list, and I don't know about you. That tells me there's something going on down there. And, they're not going down there just simply to study global warming data. Hermann Goering is not going to be interested in climate change data. And, for John Kerry, that was the cover story the State Department put out. Well, John Kerry's the chief diplomat of the United States. He took that quote-unquote detour during a diplomatic junket that he was on at the time. He could, he's the Secretary of State. He can make a phone call in Washington, D.C. and get all the climate change data in the world that he could have wished for from Antarctica. He doesn't need to fly there. Mm-hmm. So that has all the appearance to me of being kind of a spin or a cover story of some sort being put out for what the real purpose is. And the same thing with Buzz Aldrin. He made that tweet before he went down there that, I'm ready to take off for the launch pad. And I thought, okay, well, on the one hand, he's just an astronaut and using astronaut language to say, I'm getting on the plane, But the other way of interpreting that is, I'm getting on the plane to go to the launch pad. We're left speculating here, but everything on my suspicion meter tells me that, yeah, there's something going on down there, and they're not telling us about it. The Mesopotamian texts are full of this stuff, the war between Marduk and Tiamat. And the Epic of Ninurta is one of the texts that appears to allude to this war. And I reproduced the entire text in the Cosmic War, and I did it for one fundamental reason. When you sit down and read that text, it's immediately clear that you're not reading an epic of any sort whatsoever. When I think of epic, I think of Homer, Iliad and the Odyssey. The last thing I would think of would be the Epic of Ninurta, because when you sit down and actually read the text, it's about as exciting as reading the index to a Sears catalog, and that's literally what it is. It's nothing but an inventory of the technologies that were recovered from the losing side in a war. That's all it is. It's like reading the report of the French and British military attachés on German war-making potential to the Treaty of Versailles. And you sit down and read it, and you quickly discover that this is nothing but an inventory of some sort of technology that appears to be crystalline or at the minimum stone in nature. And it has four categories. Some of these technologies were taken off and used by the victors in other applications. Some of these technologies were studied, some of them were destroyed, and then there's a fourth but very, very small category of a few of these stones, tablets of destinies, whatever you wish to call them, a few of these stones that could not be destroyed and that appeared to have been referred to in the text as some sort of philosopher's stone, if you will, of weapons technology. And those were hidden. That's key. Those were hidden, according to the text. And once you acknowledge that, okay, if all of this is the case, and if indeed these ancients are talking about something that really happened in the only language that they knew how to talk about them, then you have to admit that somewhere on the surface of this planet, or possibly elsewhere, may be a cache of a lost technology, and with obvious military potential. So, put that in your thinking cap as you go back and recall what Heinrich Himmler said about the Ahnenerbe-Dienst. They had access to the same texts. And if they were reading them with these kinds of paleophysical or speculative scientific lenses, then it doesn't take much money to fund an archaeological expedition. In other words, the potential returns on investment for a minimum amount of risk are huge. So are you going to go looking for this stuff? Yeah. And, if you're the Allies and the Soviets and you win World War II and start looking at all these Nazi documents, are you going to spend a little money to see if perhaps they might have been right, or go out and try to find out what they were looking for when they were digging here or digging there? Well, sure you will. I think, I make no bones about it. I've said in many of my books, I suspect that this may be a hidden reason for the sudden explosion in the Middle East. And it's very interesting. Let's go back and, just add one more little data point here to stir into our stew of speculation. Let's recall that prior to the American invasion of Iraq in 2003, what was the excuse that was invented? Well, we had to go in there and prevent Saddam Hussein from acquiring weapons of mass destruction. Then we go into Iraq and discover, oh, lo and behold, he's not making any. Okay. Well, most people tend to think of weapons of mass destruction, and it was certainly put out that way during that time period in terms of atomic, biological, or chemical weapons. But if you're thinking in a much broader picture, if you're painting on a much broader canvas, and realize that these ancient Mesopotamian epics, which are, of course, in Iraq, if you start thinking in terms of these ancient epics talking about, wars of the gods and blowing up planets and technologies that couldn't be destroyed, so they had to be hidden, then, you're going to go looking for it. Now, it's interesting that Saddam Hussein, of course, had German and French archaeological teams digging up all over Iraq. And, that, again, raises my suspicion meter into the orange zone that, why is he digging, and why does he have the French and Germans digging for him? So, you pile speculation on speculation, but eventually the fact remains the dots are connectable. When you connect them that way, they do raise those questions, like it or not. Stephanie Daly, I forget what her book is, Ancient Mesopotamian Texts or something like that, has it. You can also find a version of it online. So it's been around, it's been known for a number of years. And I think, if I recall correctly, I reproduced the online version in the book because people will have more access to it that way. But I reproduced it so that people would actually sit and slog through and think, my word, this is probably the most boring thing I ever read. Yeah. And it is, because it's not a story. It's not an epic. It's simply an inventory. Well, the text itself, if I recall correctly, was dated to about 6 to 4 centuries BC. In other words, the cuneiform texts themselves. But here again, you have to realize that dating dating of a tablet is not necessarily the same thing as the dating of the text. The text itself, it's the old Hermetica problem. It's a story. It's a legend that's been handed down, and the text itself refers to these wars of the gods. So, in other words, if you compile I should say, if you compare the text to the interplanetary geological data and the celestial mechanics data, the idea of exploding a planet, Tom Van Flandern, the astronomer, wrote a book about the exploded planet hypothesis, the asteroid belt being the remains of an exploding planet, which is what astronomers thought when they first discovered the asteroids. He revived that hypothesis, and I think did a brilliant job of arguing in its favor, that there was some planet that's no longer there, that was blown up. Well, if you compare the two, then you would the earliest date possible in his thinking would have been about 3.2 million years ago. So in other words, if we had a sophisticated enough civilization that long ago to blow itself apart, then probably the only thing that's going to remain are stories about it. And of course, every classical civilization we know of, the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the Vedic civilizations in India, the South American native tribes, and so on, have stories of wars of the gods. Mm-hmm. So, it looks to me, if you're willing to speculate a bit, that it may have been a real thing, that they're going out looking for this stuff. That's the bottom line. I think that's exactly what they're doing. They're actually looking for it. If you look at another aspect of this story, and eventually I hope that I'll be able to look into it, I've been over the years trying to pierce the veil, but there's been enough clues that the Soviet Union was doing this during its existence, just experimenting in all sorts of very weird areas. And one of the things that they were doing was kind of following up on what the Nazis did. And I certainly think that the Western powers have as well. And the strangeness going on in Antarctica, this may be a part of the story. It may not be. I don't know. There's no evidence, but my intuition tells me it probably is, because they're certainly keeping a tight lid on any sort of factual information, and they're publishing all sorts of nonsense as to why all these people are going down there. They're looking at something. There's no doubt in my mind. And what it is, we're just not sure. But in the context of what I've been arguing in my books, I suspect that it has a great deal to do with this way of looking at some of these ancient texts, like the Epic of Ninurta, and they're actually looking for this technology. And I think that's yet another reason for our continued engagement in the Middle East. Ask yourself this. We were told when we went into the Middle East that this was all about securing oil. Well, America became more or less energy self-sufficient a couple of years ago. We don't need that Middle Eastern oil. Most people are even unaware of that. So why are we still there? I suspect that there are other pressing national security reasons that transcend, relationships with Israel or the traditional alliance with the Saudis and so on. I suspect that there's definitely something else afoot here, and they're never going to talk about it, because if they were to do so, it would sound nutty. I've always used the model. That's an excellent question. I've always used the model, and this is my basic thinking, that if there was indeed a destructive interplanetary war of some sort in this solar system, lost in the mists of prehistory, that the elites of both parties in that war are going to try, as they see the fact that, we've just blown our infrastructure for survival apart. What they're going to do is they are going to try to jumpstart and preserve as much of their knowledge as possible, and in doing so, try to jumpstart civilization again. So they're going to concoct carefully myths and legends that will endure over time, number one, so that the signal won't get lost in the noise of transmission. And number two, they're going to do it in such a way that as science advances again to their level of understanding, those texts will reveal more and more a scientific background rather than merely a mythological one. So I suspect, yeah, that's part of it, that you have two elites surviving that occasionally make common cause with each other without, at the same time remembering, hey, we just fought a war with these guys. So it's kind of like a mafia, if you want to look at it that way. The other thing I think is crucial here is that the texts themselves, particularly if you look at, Greek mythology, the Mesopotamian texts, even the Egyptian texts, hint that this is something that takes place within a huge extended family. So in other words, it's a civil war. And my model for talking about this ancient war is to think, to tell people, think of World War I. Kaiser Wilhelm II is the grandson of Queen Victoria of England. His mother was English. So therefore, this is why you see the Kaiser going so often to Great Britain. The Kaiser spoke English very well. Most people don't know that. You can actually go on YouTube and listen to an old Dutch radio broadcast of Kaiser Wilhelm II after the war when he was in exile in Holland and hear him talking English. And it's, a typical upper-class British English that he's speaking. But, he's related to the royal family in Great Britain. His cousin is King of England during the war. He's related by marriage to Tsar Nicholas II, and related to most of the other royal houses in Europe, including the Habsburgs, the Savoys. So in other words, if you look at World War I in a certain sense, it's a big family feud. And the result of it is, peculiarly, the only royal family, the Windsors, or to give them their proper German family name, the House of Saxe, Coburg und Gotha, they changed their name to Windsor during the war because, everybody knew that the whole family was German. The ancient texts are saying the same thing. You have this god fighting that god, but if you look at the family tree, so to speak, they're all related to each other. Well, if we assume that all of these texts are talking more or less in a very broad way about the Atlantis myth, the most compelling ones that I personally think that reveal this war and this relationship would be things like the Epic of Ninurta, the N.W.O texts in Egypt, which you can't even get a hold of translations of those, to my knowledge, in any public form. You're still reliant on secondary sources, and I forget the name of the lady that R.H. Reynolds or something like that that published a book about the N.W.O texts, but nevertheless fascinating. Andrew Collins has published a bit about the N.W.O text, but those texts, some of the Ugaritic texts, which is a civilization kind of at the northwestern end of the Fertile Crescent on up into Turkey, some of those texts talk about it. Certainly some of the Vedic texts, again, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, they talk about wars of the gods all the time. This is a fairly universal idea, and again, you get a whiff of that war in Plato's version of it, because, he emphasizes over and over again that Atlantis was a very warlike society, made war on Greece, and was ultimately defeated. So, the idea of war in Atlantis and advanced technologies are always kind of hovering, clustered together. And some of the South American Indian legends have some very interesting perspectives on it as well, particularly the legends surrounding Pumapunku, Titicaca in Bolivia. So this is a fairly widespread phenomenon. And the clincher here that takes me back to the idea that with the Atlantis mythology, and I'm speaking now not simply in terms of Plato's version, but the whole cluster of concepts around it. When you look at it and look at the Mesopotamian texts and realize that when you're dealing with the gods in Mesopotamian lore are closely associated with astrology. So in other words, many of the names of the gods are names of celestial bodies, planets, and so on. And they're always associated with mountains. Mountains become another, as I said before, another term for planets. But mountains are also the same word. And I forget now the Akkadian word for mountain. I should know that. I've been working too hard. But the same word for mountain in Akkadian is the same word for a pyramid, for a ziggurat. So, look at that cluster of concepts now. They're all banded together: planets, gods, mountains, and pyramids, and war. It's a very strange thing. And the bottom line for me is that, yeah, I do suspect that there's a kernel of truth lurking here in the middle of all these myths and civilizations in that part of the world, and the gigantic scale of their construction, the skill that was evident in that construction. And I'm not talking just about the Great Pyramid of Giza. I'm thinking of Baalbek. I'm thinking of Pumu Punku in South America. These enormous structures that baffle engineers to this day. How did they do this? And do it with such precision that's difficult for us to reproduce to this day. So there's a technology here that we are simply, we're staring at the manifestation of that technology. My only academic publications were in theology. Look, we have to get over this idea that you have to have a credential in something to have an arguable opinion. Scientists are always making pronouncements about theology, so I don't have any hesitation to make. What I am is I'm a documents researcher, and I'm willing to speculate on the basis of a kind of, okay, take this proposition as a given, then what does it mean? That's what I'm doing. I'm taking the text more or less as the given that they are reporting as truthfully as they can in the language they had available on things that may have happened, and trying to examine them in a modern scientific context. And when you do that, it is clear that something is going on. And when you combine all of the data together, it's giving you a pretty good prima facie case, if I can use the legal term, that something happened. It may have been a war, and if it's a war and it was that destructive, then there's a technology behind it. And if there's a technology behind it, there's a civilization behind it. So, the argument is fairly clear. It's an interplanetary war. One of the things, if people don't believe me, in the Cosmic War book, toward the end of the book, I point out, I have a picture of the moon of Saturn that's called Iapetus or Iapetus, all right? And this picture was taken by the Cassini probe as it approached Saturn. And next to that picture is a picture of George Lucas's Death Star from the Star Wars movies. And if you compare the two pictures, I defy anybody not to have their jaw on the floor. Which is interesting because, of course, if it's a moon of Saturn, that raises the stakes again. Because Saturn, the planet, is Kronos in Greek. Mm-hmm. And when you examine the Greek mythology, where is the war of the gods fought and who's fighting it? Well, it's the Greek god Kronos, the war of the Titans, the Gigantomachy. So, again, you have to read these texts very, very carefully. They're multi-layered things. You must remember that the names of the gods are also names of planets. So what does that mean? The catastrophists think that this is simply an allegory of planetary collisions and acts of nature. I don't. I think that the names of the planets are like titular names, okay? The Kronos being the name of whoever's in charge of Saturn at the time. And again, when you start piling up the evidences that many researchers have put out that certain features on celestial bodies in our solar system, if this is the case, then you're dealing, and I think there's, again, enough evidence out there that prima facie allows one to hold that position as a rational position. Certainly it doesn't constitute proof, because any picture can